Good evening, wherever you are. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk to you about DevOps transformations. So my name is Noel DaCosta. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm a senior director here at 3Cloud, and I lead the DevOps, DevSecOps, and SRE practice. It's a practice here that supports all of our different practice areas because it's involved in all that we do. I have 25 years experience, 25 plus years. I started out in app dev as a systems software engineer, and then did the whole spectrum of the IT delivery life cycle. And for the last 10 plus years, I've been focused on DevOps. This is when DevOps became a household name in 2009. And since then, I've been focused on doing DevOps. I'm responsible for enabling DevOps at our clients. So that includes anything from small tactical solutions where we brought in to solve some tactical problems, as well as enabling DevOps transformations across the whole enterprise. So you can feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you choose to, and I'm looking forward to having this discussion with you as we go forward. So let's talk about what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to align on what our definition is of DevOps, because when you ask that question of anybody, you're probably going to get as many answers. So we're going to share with you what our point of view of DevOps is. Then if you're here at this webinar today, there's a reason why you're interested in DevOps. So let's talk about those reasons. Why do we want to implement DevOps? And then how do you go about enabling DevOps? What are the strategies to do that? And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. However, feel free during the presentation to put your questions in the chat, and at periodic moments during the presentation, I will answer those questions as appropriate. All right, so next we're going to do a poll question. Crystal, back to you.
All right, everyone, you should see the poll question on your screen. I'm going to give you guys about 30 seconds or so to answer, and then I will share the results with you guys, and then I will pass it back over to Noel. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close this out, and I will share the results with you guys. The question is, are you currently on a DevOps enablement journey? 74% said yes, and 26% said no.
All right, thank you, Crystal. So that gives me an idea of what the audience is here. So it looks like a lot of folks here are looking to see how to enable DevOps transformations. They don't have one currently going on. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, what is DevOps? So here's a definition that we align with. It's a union of people, process, and product to enable continuous delivery of value to end users. So the key word here is value and continuous delivery. What that means is that if your whole process is not recognizing value at the end of it, it has to be reconsidered. Also, people, process, and product. You may have heard that DevOps is a cultural change. It is. It involves changing how people work, how they collaborate, the environment in which they collaborate, and so on. So it involves changing the culture in which you work. So people is very, very important. In fact, of the three things, people, process, and product, I believe that the most challenging part is the people part of it. Next, process. We look at process, the current processes that we do, and we should ask the question, why are we doing that? If it's because that's the way we've always done it, when I started here, that's what they were doing, it's time to revisit that. So is there a potential to make those lean and to improve those processes? And finally, the product. That's the technology stack that you're going to be using to automate these processes. So this definition implies that DevOps is a set of principles and practices that enables an organization to make the delivery of applications lean and efficient, while leveraging feedback from customers and users to continuously improve. So now the continuous improvement that we talk about here comes from the feedback mechanism. So this feedback mechanism that you see here is what we leverage here. It's a continuous cycle. Our point of view of DevOps spans the whole IT delivery life cycle, all the way from planning, development, building, testing, release, deploying, operations, and monitoring. And then it continues in that one continuous feedback loop. So if you were to ask the question, what is DevOps to a number of different individuals, you might hear things like, oh, it's infrastructure automation. Oh, it's CI/CD. Oh, it's code management. So in our point of view, it's all of these things. So it's continuous delivery across the entire life cycle. So we have to ask the question, how do we make this process of delivering the application leaner and more efficient? So the key thing is we gather feedback and then continuously improve the process. So hopefully we're aligned on what DevOps is and what we're going to be covering today. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, why do we do DevOps? So the business benefits that are enabled by DevOps are speed to market. The biggest challenge with organizations today is they have an idea, a concept, and they want to make it available to their customers, because that's when you start recognizing value. But then how long is it going to take you to get that product to market? If you typically have challenges with getting it to market in a timely manner, DevOps helps you resolve that. The next thing is quality. If you have a product delivered and available to your customers, is it buggy? Are there a lot of problems with it? Does it fail periodically? That's not acceptable. So how do you improve quality and availability of your application in production? Then we talked about this earlier with process improvement and making your processes lean. Are you doing the right things with your resources, making optimal use of them? We want to look at any wastage and make sure we address those issues. And ultimately, that results in a great customer experience, because you're in business to serve your customers, and your business is actually improved when your customers are satisfied. All right, let's look at it from a different perspective. What challenges does DevOps help overcome? So here are typically the challenges that are overcome by DevOps. Long delivery lead times to introduce products. The question is, where is the bottleneck? You don't know where. It could be from the exchange between business and IT in terms of the requirements and articulating what those are, understanding those requirements. It could be the development process itself that's not ideal. It could be your QA function that's not capturing the right defects. It could be anything. So the idea here is to figure out in that whole delivery chain, where are the bottlenecks and what needs to be addressed. The next point is the collaboration between business decision makers and IT decision makers. Often there's a disconnect. Business has this idea, this concept, and they translate those into requirements that IT is expected to deliver. The question is, how clear are those requirements? Business is imagining that they're going to get a pear, and IT delivers an apple. So one of the key things is, how do we make sure that there is collaboration between the two groups and the agenda is being met? Poor quality, significant number of bugs and defects, and a higher cost to resolve. You might have heard that the later in this delivery process that a defect is identified, the more expensive it is to resolve. So both from a perspective of the resolution, but also from the impacts to the customer and the outages to the business. So it's important to shift that that quality left into the development process. Here's another one, lack of understanding and planning for non-functional as well as your functional requirements. What are non-functional requirements? Those are the things that are typically seen as outside the scope of a functional requirement. So let's say you need to develop a certain functionality. So most often we look at the functional aspects of that. But the question is, at the end of the sprint, when you've got that widget ready, is it ready to deliver to production? And more often than not, the answer is no, because you have to look at compliance, you have to look at security, you have to look at approval gates, and there are a number of different things that need to be addressed before it gets to production. These are what we refer to as non-functional requirements. In my opinion, they should really be functional requirements and addressed within your sprint so that they're not a blocker later in the process. So it needs attention. We have to focus our attention on non-functional requirements as well. Then one thing that DevOps does is bridges the gaps between the various groups that are involved in this delivery process, all the way from development, security, and the operations teams, and all of the stakeholders in between. Just like I mentioned, there are a number of different stakeholders involved, not just dev and ops. You have change management, you have security, you have compliance, all the different groups that might be involved and need to put their stamp of approval before it moves along. So how do you get them involved in this process to collaborate together? We're going to talk a little bit about that. The other thing is that DevOps seeks to automate everything as much as possible. So manual provisioning of any resources is error prone and it's slow. So how do we automate across the whole stack? Then the other thing is staying compliant with regulatory and security requirements. We've implemented DevOps solutions where the problem that we solved was lack of compliance. Implementing DevOps solutions was able to meet regulatory compliance and be able to pass the audits because of what DevOps does for the process. It creates traceability, it creates auditability, it creates visibility, separation of duties, it creates access controls, and so on. All of these are controls that can be demonstrated to an auditor to meet regulatory compliance, including data privacy and data governance. And finally, security is key. What's the point of delivering an application to production and it exposes vulnerabilities? You don't want to be headlines the next day. So security starts right from the beginning. It's everybody's responsibility. So you want to make sure that security is addressed as soon as possible in the DevOps cycle and make sure that security vulnerabilities are not delivered into production with every deployment. So let's go to the next thing and see how we accomplish this. So we have these challenges. We understand what DevOps is. How do we engage to start building a strategy for making this real? So let's start with this. Agile culture. We talked about the people side of things. From a people perspective, how do we work together? How do we collaborate? We have cross-functional teams that need to be engaged. In a very siloed organization, it proves challenging because the teams don't work together and it creates bottlenecks. So even though we can implement DevOps for non-agile, waterfall type delivery methods, it goes best with Agile and reaps a lot of the benefits with Agile together. You can achieve your outcomes. So it applies some of these lean principles to development and testing, and DevOps applies them to end-to-end application delivery, all the way from ideation to production. So it's actually important to take the time to map your delivery pipeline and understand where the bottlenecks are. So you might want to leverage things like customer journey mapping, value stream mapping, to be able to understand where the bottleneck is. Which brings us to customer focus. So when you talk about Agile culture, you have a product owner that's responsible for driving the priority of your backlog. How do they make those decisions? One of the key things that drives that is customer centricity. Is it creating value for the customer, for the end result? If not, it should be deprioritized. So it's not just at the whim of the product owner. It needs to be based on the customer focus. So, and this actually results in faster time to market. Sorry, metrics-driven transformation. As with any transformation, you want to be able to measure where you are today, to understand what gaps exist and what it's going to take to get to your target state. You cannot do that unless you have clear measurements. The DevOps tool chain that we implement has a lot of inherent metrics that enable you to figure out where you are, take a baseline, a snapshot, then implement a DevOps transformation initiative, and then take periodic measurements to see how you're doing. Without that, it's really meaningless. Continuous quality control. We talked about QA. One of the key things to keep in mind is that QA shouldn't be something outside the sprint or later in the delivery lifecycle. You might have heard the term shift left before. It says shifting quality left. Make it everybody's responsibility. Quality is everyone's responsibility, and do it as soon as you can, which means do it in the coding stage itself so the developers have feedback on how their code is coming along. We leverage tools here for static code analysis to be able to see whether you're following standards and if your code is potentially going to create any bugs. We look at leveraging tools for unit test coverage so that the developers understand if their code is not, the unit test they've written doesn't have adequate code coverage. We also then leverage some functional tests that can be implemented in the dev cycle itself so that the developers have early feedback and can remedy it before it gets to any QA individual. So it's a continuous quality control mechanism. The moment you check your code into a code repository, there's a build, a CI/CD process that kicks off and runs these automated processes. Next, let's look at vendor management. Very few applications or product exist in a silo unless they're microservices that are clearly independent. They're typically dependency on other products, especially third-party products. So if you're trying to deliver rapidly, but then you come to a standstill waiting for a vendor's component or a piece to be completed, that can be challenging. You don't achieve your goal of faster time to market. So one of the key things we need to look at here is the SLAs and the agreements that you have with your vendors and being able to support you to deliver as fast as you need to do. Next, let's look at the end-to-end process. Like we talked about earlier, and as visible here in this infinity loop, DevOps is an end-to-end process. If you look at it just tactically or just to solve a specific problem, all you serve to do is shift the bottleneck to a different part of the process, and you don't get the outcomes that you're looking to do. So it's important to take a look at the DevOps holistically across the whole IT delivery lifecycle, and then define a strategy to address it holistically, even if you start small. We're going to talk about how we do that shortly. We talked also about security and risk. One of the key things with DevOps is you're delivering a product that could be exposed to your customers, to the internet. Are you making sure that you've secured it adequately? How do security vulnerabilities enter your tool chain into your product? It starts all the way from requirements onwards. So you could have a stray requirement that's not been approved that could be actioned upon. You could have code that's improperly written that creates these vulnerabilities anywhere along this process. So we want to make sure that we address security and we shift security left, just like we do quality. So it becomes everybody's responsibility. Security is not just the cybersecurity team's responsibility. And then finally, infrastructure and operations. So the ops portion here is the part of DevOps that receives the product and is supposed to support that product in production and make sure that it meets your requirements for uptime and resiliency. So the question is, how do you enable operations to be able to successfully support that product? Do you have the right handoffs from dev to ops so that they know what's coming into their realm to be supported? And this team typically is the infrastructure team as well. And so they're looking at supporting your infrastructure. How is that infrastructure provisioned? How are the environments compared to each other? Is there configuration drift? Is your dev, your QA, your staging and prod configured equivalently so that a test in each of these environments is relevant? So one of the ways to accomplish that is with infrastructure as code. So with DevOps, infrastructure as code is key. We want to restrict access to the infrastructure portal directly, in our case, Azure, to the Azure portal, and allow all of those resources to be deployed programmatically. So that's what we have with infrastructure as code. So let me talk next a little bit about security, because that is a key factor in DevOps. When we do DevOps, we implicitly mean DevSecOps, where we build security into it. However, the term DevSecOps has been coined to explicitly include security in this process. So when we do DevOps, security should be at the heart of it all across your entire IT delivery life cycle. You want to secure your DevOps tool chain, have the right access controls in place. You want to have branch policies. You want to make sure that your build definitions are under version control. All of the, your test cases and test results are all secured, and you have the right visibility and access to those. Additionally, you want to be able to leverage tools to scan developer code for security vulnerabilities that could be introduced. So you have security scanning tools like Veracode, Fortify, Checkmarks, and so on that can scan code for vulnerabilities even before it's built and deployed. Then you also want to implement dynamic scanning tools. So once you deploy your code to a target environment, scan that environment to see if any vulnerabilities have been included. And one more area too is with use of shared libraries. So if you use open source code, for example, from maven.org or from NuGet.org, you want to make sure that those dependencies of those libraries have been approved for use in your code and that they're not exposing your application to any vulnerabilities. So the process and how you make that available to your development team is critical. Do you want to let them pull it in real time and bind it during the build, or do you want to make sure that it's accessed from a secure repository where it's been vetted and approved for use? So those are the kind of things that we want to address in this space. So now I think we're going to go to a poll question, and then while we're doing that, I will take a look and see if any questions have been posted in the question box.
All right, everyone, I'm gonna give you guys about 30 seconds or so to answer the poll. So, and then I'll share the results with you guys. All right, share the results with you guys here. So the question is, how would you rate your organization's present DevOps maturity? 18% said 0, no DevOps. 41% said 1, not mature. 33% said 2, somewhat mature. 5% said 3, mature. And 3% said 4, very mature. All right, we'll go ahead and close this out, and I'll pass it back over to you, Noel.
Thank you, Crystal. Let me share my screen again. It's already been seen. Good. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that a lot of you are on a DevOps journey. There's not adequate maturity at this point in time and looking at how you might want to improve your maturity. So that's what this webinar is supposed to do. I don't see any questions in the chat. If you feel you have any questions that you'd like to be addressed right now, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, we can have them at the end. So let's continue with our presentation here. We're going to talk now about the tool chain that we use. So we talked about people and process, where Agile comes into play to address the people, the collaboration part of it. We're looking at bringing in process improvements, we're looking at value stream mapping and so on to help you with your process. Now let's talk about the tooling. So one of the key things we mentioned is that DevOps automates your processes. So you need a tool chain in which to do that. As a Microsoft Gold partner, we specialize in Azure DevOps. Our teams work with a different set of tools that are open source tools and other tools, but our focus here is Azure DevOps, and we facilitate a lot of migrations to Azure DevOps. For those who are not familiar, this is similar to TFS that you have on your on-premise, or VSTS, Visual Studio Team Services, that you can still have on premises, but Azure DevOps is the cloud-hosted version of that toolchain. You might see here a couple of icons for GitHub. We'll talk about that in a moment. But let's start with this toolchain here. So Azure boards allow you to manage your Agile process. It provides you a tool to collaborate, to manage your Agile process. It allows you to have sprints. It allows you to follow Scrum or other methodologies or even Kanban. So it allows you to create a backlog and work with that backlog to be able to deliver your sprints. This is where the collaboration happens between your business, represented by the product owner, and then your app dev teams to collaborate and understand that the user stories make sense, that they are going to be delivering value, and that the right stories have been prioritized for delivery in a sprint. Next, we're going to look at pipelines. So pipelines, if you're not familiar with those, are a tool that enables you to build your application and deploy it to your target environments. It also enables you to run a number of processes in between, if you will, for security, for validation of various things before you deploy it to your production environment. That's typically referred to as CI/CD. Continuous integration says that the moment a developer checks their code into the code repository, you initiate a process that does a build and verifies that the code commit did not break the build. And then you deploy it to a target environment, and then you can run a number of different tests or scans to make sure that it meets the quality gates that you've set up in here. So that's another thing to talk about. We're talking about unattended deliveries potentially all the way through to production upon a code commit. So with that, you have to have automated gates. So what are those gates? They're quality gates. They could be anything that you need, approval gates and so on. And CI/CD pipelines in Azure allow you to do that. GitHub Actions also allows you to do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about that on the next slide, why we bring up GitHub into this conversation. The next would be your Azure repos. So repos are where you store your code and version control. So you could potentially do that in Azure repos or as well as in GitHub. With Azure repos, you have the ability to have unlimited hosting of Git repos. Or if you choose, if you're migrating from TFS, for example, and you want to stay with TFVC for whatever reason, or SVN, you could do that in Azure repos, even though the recommendation is that you use Git hosted repos. Test plans. So test plans enable you to manage your whole application life cycle. So it looks at your test cases, your test suites, links them to the work item that drove that change so that you know what you're testing against, which user story, for example, and manage the whole defect and defect resolution life cycle. So you might have heard of typical ALM tools. That's what this test plans enable you to do. And it has integration with pipelines as well as with boards. This is for you to be able to do your manual testing, and it also integrates with any automated testing that you may have so that you can tie a test case to an automation script, for example. And then artifacts. This is what I was referring to earlier, where you want to share dependencies and libraries that you might want to create internally, or you might want to import from maven.org, NuGet.org, or other organizations. So you can host those dependencies in Azure Artifacts. You can have them security scanned and vetted and approved, and the developers then can use this here to bind to their code during the CI/CD process. For additional resources, you go to azure.com/DevOps, and you're going to be able to see the whole tool chain and what they can do for you. So this is a seamless integrated tool chain that's available for you in Azure DevOps for little or no cost. So let's talk a little bit about these two components here for GitHub. Here, why is that relevant? Actually, I'm going to, so you might know that in 2018, Microsoft bought GitHub. So there's an effort underway currently to merge the feature sets of both those tools. So there's potentially just one tool set going forward. Currently, that's the reason why we say that if you want to use some components from GitHub, you have to look at what your business reason is for doing that and understand whether you should go to GitHub or use Azure DevOps. Azure DevOps. Before we go into that, I want to just have a little bit of a clarification here on the term Git, GitHub, and so on, because there's a bit of confusion often in this space. So Git is your source control, your version control repository for code. And when you refer to Git, it could be a local repo on your own instance, and it helps you manage your code with branches. Now, GitHub, on the other hand, is an open source location for you to manage your code, especially if you're developing open source libraries. GitHub allows you to collaborate in that environment. And Azure DevOps repos, again, is a Git repo that's hosted on Azure DevOps and provides you unlimited Git hosting. So these two right here are similar in functionality. So why do we bring up the topic of GitHub? because there are still questions right now. Should I go with Azure DevOps or should we implement GitHub? And the question is not so much which one or the other, but potentially using both. There's a collaboration between the two. You could deliver with Azure DevOps as well as GitHub, leveraging some components from here and some from here. So all of this depends on your current business use case, what you're planning to do, and your migration path, where you're migrating from, which tool set you choose. That said, you could choose to use boards from here, repos from here, pipelines from here, or you could use GitHub Actions and so on to suit your specific purpose. A recommendation that's typically made is if it's a new project, look to see if it can be done on GitHub Enterprise. If it's a current project, maybe you can migrate just the code repos across to GitHub. So this is a conversation that's on a one-on-one basis with each client, with each project, with each application to figure out what that journey is. So Microsoft is working on a roadmap. So finally, when it's time to move to GitHub Enterprise entirely, there will be a seamless migration path to migrate from Azure DevOps to GitHub. So for now, the right option is to check what your needs are and figure out whether you need to stay entirely in Azure DevOps, entirely move to GitHub, or have a combination of the two tools. So Azure DevOps is actually an open source, an open system, if you will, that allows you to integrate with a number of different tool sets, as I'm going to show you in the next slide here. So for planning and tracking your work, which is the boards and so on, then we talk about how you build your code, how you deploy your code to your target environments, and how you operate and use monitoring to be able to support your operations function. All of these are supported by tools in the marketplace. So one of the key things we want to call out is that Azure DevOps is not an all or nothing discussion. You could use any or all of the components or blend them with other components that are available in the marketplace. If you have investments in any of these tool sets and want to continue using them, there is an integration with Azure DevOps. If you go to the Azure DevOps Marketplace, you'll see that there is a plugin or an integration that for all of these different tools. So starting with one of the key things that we want to call out here is that even though these options are available to you, if you are on a DevOps transformation journey or an initiative, we recommend that you take a look at your tool sets and see whether it makes sense to consolidate to a specific tool set that most of the organization can use to avoid tool sprawl, reduce your costs of the tools, and also the kind of skill sets that you need to maintain in this environment. So all of these tools are available here, and this is not an exhaustive list, by the way. There are a whole bunch of other tools that also do connect. Let me pause here and see if any questions have come up in here. So there's a question here that says, can pipelines deliver directly to VMs in Azure? Absolutely. So that's one of the key things in Azure DevOps is that your pipelines can either deliver entire applications to application services, to serverless, to functions and so on. It can also deliver to VMs. It can also configure those VMs. So whatever, you might have a favorite configuration tool if you want to use Ansible or Chef or Puppet. Using pipelines, we could configure those applications to target environments. Could modify the configuration of those VMs. Good question. Please feel free to post any other questions in there as you wish. All right, if there are no questions on this at the moment, well, let's go on to the next thing, which is a third poll question. Crystal, back to you.
All right, everyone, I'm gonna give you guys about 30 seconds or so to answer. Like Noel was saying, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat, but I'll give you guys about 30 seconds or so, and then I'll come back and share the results with you guys. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close this and share the results with you guys. The question is, are you currently using Azure DevOps or planning to migrate to Azure DevOps? 68% said yes, 26% said no, and 6% said no, but looking to migrate in the next 90 days. All right, Noel, I'm gonna go ahead and pass it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Crystal. And let me see that, make sure that you're still seeing my screen. Yes, okay, great. So what that indicates is that most of you are using Azure DevOps. The question is, are we using it appropriately? So you want to take a look at that to make sure that your usage of that tool chain is adequate, that you're leveraging all the capabilities of the tools and the third-party tools that you need to leverage for code coverage, for code quality, test automation, and so on. All right, so the question now that comes up is, how do we make this real? What's the next step to make the strategy real? Let's take a look at how to do this. All right, we've covered a lot of stuff. And if you look at that, it can be quite intimidating. And you have to ask the question, where do I start? You just definitely want to make sure you don't boil the ocean. So this is a typical recommendation that we do with our clients on a journey like this. Because we say, let's start with step one, which is do a health check. Assess where we are today. Take a snapshot of a baseline metrics, if you will, that measure where you are on the DevOps maturity scale. It could be 0, that you don't have anything in place. It could be 1, it could be a 2. You could have different components here that are at a higher maturity than others. But like I'd mentioned, you want to make sure that this is looked at holistically. So how are you doing across the board? Are you good in one area and potentially shifted the bottleneck somewhere else? So this health check does that for you. It looks across this thing holistically, understands the gaps that need to be addressed. It helps you design the target state in Azure DevOps where you want to be, and then identify a roadmap and the recommendations needed to get from where you are to where you want to be in that target state. So at the end of this, we have a prescription, if you will, that says these are the things, the gaps that we have seen. These are the recommendations that need to be done to address those gaps. Let's make it real. So one of the best ways to do it is start small, work with one team or one application, and implement a jump start and a migration to Azure DevOps. So you look at this whole stack that we talked about, starting with Agile project management, code, CI/CD pipelines, monitoring, pipelines for data lifecycle management, and that whole spectrum. Implement that in a form of a pilot, if you will, with one team, and then now you have a working model that you can showcase to the rest of the enterprise, and then you could start scaling this to the rest of the enterprise. One of the things that I failed to mention earlier was pipelines for data lifecycle management. I'd mentioned that we know that we have pipelines for building and deploying your application. We also have pipelines for doing infrastructure as code, which is creating your infrastructure resources in Azure programmatically and using pipelines to deploy them. We also want to make sure that from a data services perspective, all that's in that process is automated. If you deploy your application to a CI/CD pipeline automatically, but then you have a manual process where it pauses and then your data admins have to come in there, log into the system, run some stored procedures, make some schema changes before you can proceed, that can be a slowdown and a bottleneck. All of that can be automated. So we also want to make sure that you factor in DevOps for your data lifecycle as well, so that potentially everything is automated. So once you have this working model and you've vetted it and showcased to the rest of the organization, you've made adjustments as to what needed to be fine-tuned, you now have a model that has to be scaled to the enterprise. This is where you develop a DevOps transformation strategy. You look at the whole enterprise holistically, look at the different groups, understand the different needs of the various teams. Some may lend themselves more to Agile, others, which may be some of your legacy systems, might want to continue waterfall mode until they've been modernized. So you want to consider all of these things during your strategy and define a process to move forward. Then you have a strategy roadmap. And typically with DevOps, because of the scale of the change, it's a multi-month, multi-year initiative. But it's absolutely necessary to support any kind of digital transformation that your organization is undergoing. The DevOps transformation goes hand in hand with that, because as you digitally transform and automate all of your processes, you modernize your applications, you modernize your data estate and so on. DevOps is key to all of that. DevOps involved in data, is involved with migrations to the cloud. It's involved with leveraging cloud native application technologies and stacks. So you want to make sure that you look at it holistically across the board and develop a strategy and implement it. So this brings us to the end of our presentation. And now we're going to open up for questions. I hope some more questions are in the chat. I'm going to look in there. If not, please feel free to type them in right now. Crystal, I only see that last question that's asked about pipelines delivering to VMs. Do you see any that I'm not seeing?
You do have a few more in here. I'm going to go ahead and read them off to you. What is the best strategy to start DevOps in your company? Should we start with the board or repos, or what would be the best option?
Now, that's a great question. Like I mentioned here, for example, in this slide, there are different components in here. If you're not doing any of these currently, or if you have a manual process, or you're doing bits and pieces in other tool sets, you want to consider doing a minimum viable product across all of these components. The reason being, let's say you implement boards. So now you're managing your requirements in an agile manner. You have epics, user stories, features, and tasks. But you still cannot get the momentum that you need because you haven't got these other pieces in place. Let's say from a code management perspective, do you have a proper branching and merging strategy to be able to support your delivery? If you want to develop in parallel, if you want to develop within your sprints. So all of these mechanisms need to be in place. So that's where, when we talk about this jumpstart here, this talks about doing an MVP, a minimum viable product, across all of these pieces. So you don't have to have all the bells and whistles, all the controls in place, all the thresholds really high. You start with them small and just make sure you have all of this integrated tool chain connected right at the beginning. That's a good question. Anything else?
All right, your next question is, do you have a preferred tool to manage the repos? It seems that repos are very flat in their organization.
So we recommend Git. So Git is the standard nowadays for hosting your repos. So if you look at GitHub, if you look at other hosting other than SVN and TFS or TFVC, all of those have their limitations. The one that's most widely used, and for all of the benefits that it has, like a distributed platform, it allows you to do custom branching and merging to support your needs. It allows you to have branch policies to be able to make sure you have gated process, like pull requests, for example. You don't let any developer commit their code to a control branch unless they make a pull request, and that's been validated by a peer or by automated processes that make sure that it didn't break the build, that you have some automated tests run against them, and then you approve the pull request. So Git repos lend themselves to that very well. So if you have a preference though for other tool sets, it's okay to use them because Azure DevOps likely works with them. The key thing is, can your pipeline integrate with that repository to be able to pull the code and build it? Potentially, yes. We've integrated with many different systems, but ideally the recommendation would be to use GitHub, Git repos, whether it's in Azure repos with unlimited hosting or in GitHub as well with unlimited hosting. And both of those connect seamlessly to Azure pipelines. Great question. Any more?
That looks to be all. Someone asking, can we get a copy of the video? Yes, you can get a copy of the video. It will be emailed to you tomorrow around noon Eastern Standard Time. So just see that. And you can also download Noel's PowerPoint in the handout section. That is the last question.
Well, thank you so much. I'm happy to have had this opportunity to present to you. If there are any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You had my LinkedIn link earlier. Please feel free to connect. I'm happy to talk to you after this. Thank you so much and have a great day.
All right. Thank you so much, Noelle, for hosting. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for everybody that has attended. Like I just stated, you guys will be able to receive the recording tomorrow around noon Eastern Standard Time. So please look out for that. You guys will receive that in your email box along with any contact information that you guys need from us. If you guys have any questions from now until then, please feel free to reach out to Noelle or myself. I hope you guys have a good rest of your Tuesday. Again, Noelle, thank you so much for hosting, and everyone have a good day. And don't forget to download the handout under the handout section so that you guys can have the PowerPoint. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.